The attack began at around 9 a.m. local time. Russian helicopter gunships blasted the outskirts of the village. Explosions could be seen among the houses. In the village, our cameraman found Chechen rebels digging trenches as they prepare to fight to the death.
We are not afraid. We will defend ourselves, and the Russians can destroy this place if they want to.
The Chechens overheard radio messages from Russian commanders ordering their troops to surround the convoy. On the buses, the hostages began to wave white flags to try and persuade their army not to fire on them.
The Russians gave up trying to free the hostages in Pervomayskoye today. Instead, they've been pouring rocket and shell fire into the village near the Chechnya border in an all-out barrage, apparently calculated to obliterate the rebels.
Relatives of the civilian hostages gathered near the scene, many in obvious distress. Residents are now fleeing this area in panic.
ITN News at 10 with Trevor McDonald.
Held at gunpoint, the hostages awaiting their fate. Good evening. 2,000 hostages, many of them women and children, are still being held at gunpoint tonight in a hospital in southern Russia. Their captors are Chechen guerrillas, demanding Russia's withdrawal from their country and apparently prepared to kill and be killed. A similar hostage-taking last June ended in more than 100 civilian deaths and the Russian climb down. Today, a furious President Yeltsin rounded on his generals for letting it happen again and demanded immediate and resolute action. Our Moscow correspondent Julian Mannion got to Kizlyar a short time ago and near to the besieged hospital. He told me what's happening there tonight.
We're on the outskirts of Kizlyar. The authorities are keeping journalists out of the town tonight. They say they're going to admit us tomorrow morning. But from where we are, a couple of miles away from the hospital, we've seen flares hanging over that building, and we've heard the sound of sporadic gunfire, quite heavy gunfire about an hour ago, though that's died away now. On our way here, and that's only a couple of hours ago, we passed an enormous column of Russian armor moving towards the town. It appeared to be a full motorized division on the move.
From what you've seen, do you get the impression that the Russians are preparing to end this siege?
The Russians certainly have the ability to end this by force, but it could cost enormous bloodshed. And right now, tonight, they must be really wondering what their next move will be.
Julian Mannion, thank you. The latest Russian hostage crisis is still unresolved tonight, with Chechen hostage takers nearly home but surrounded by Russian troops. The number of hostages is now down to about 160. The Chechens are demanding safe passage and are again threatening to kill if they don't get it. Their convoy left the southern Russian town of Kizlyar heading for Chechnya, but was stopped at Pervomayskoye, a small village on the border. ITN's Julian Mannion watched events unfold there today.
Boris Yeltsin had promised a resolute response to this latest act of Chechen terrorism. But early this morning, a convoy of buses, including both the terrorists and about 150 of their hostages, was allowed to leave for Chechnya. As they moved towards the border, the gunmen seemed jubilant, their hostages relatively calm. A woman hostage even held a rifle that a Chechen had lent her. All of them appeared to believe that a deal had been done and that the Russian government would stick to it, in spite of the helicopter gunships roaring above them. The convoy has now come to a virtual halt on a broken piece of road over which the vehicles can only crawl. Russian helicopters are circling overhead, occasionally swooping low to buzz the terrorists. But so far, there's no sign of an all-out Russian attack. But at a village on the Chechen border, the tension suddenly grew. When one bus got stuck, Chechens and Russians confronted each other only yards apart. And when the buses tried to move forward again, the Russians halted them in an open field. The Chechens overheard radio messages from Russian commanders ordering their troops to surround the convoy. Helicopter gunships fired bursts of warning shots to prevent the buses from moving, and for a time it seemed that an assault was imminent. On the buses, the hostages began to wave white flags to try and persuade their army not to fire on them. After several hours of standoff, heavily armed Chechens advanced on the nearby Russian border post. Inside, Russian Special Forces troops appeared in no mood to resist, and they rapidly surrendered, stacking their weapons neatly against a wall. The Chechens took over the whole village, and tonight they remain there with their hostages. The Russian Prime Minister Viktor Chernomyrdin has promised that violence will not be used against the convoy, and that must represent some hope that further bloodshed can be avoided. Julian Mannion, News at 10 on the Chechen-Dagestan border. Russian Special Forces troops are getting ready for action as their army throws a ring of steel around the village where the Chechen rebels are still holding more than 100 hostages. At the scene, a Russian general has said that the gunmen must be eliminated. Every type of heavy equipment is now being moved towards the village of Pervomayskoye. Negotiations are still taking place, but it all looks ominously like the preparations for an assault. ITN was the only television company to slip through the Russian army cordon. In the village, our cameraman found Chechen rebels digging trenches as they prepare to fight to the death. The Chechens have placed small groups of fighters in different parts of the village, each group holding some of the hostages. Many of the hostages are women and children, now clearly in some distress, cooped up in houses abandoned by local residents.
We are not afraid. We will defend ourselves, and the Russians can destroy this place if they want to.
The Chechens have told the Russians that they will release many of the women and children in exchange for a written guarantee of safe conduct. But the Russians say that all the hostages must be released now. As the deadlock continues, the rebels are putting on a show of defiant bravado before what could be their final battle. Julian Mannion, News at 10 on the Chechen-Dagestan border.
Chechen rebels holding dozens of hostages now have until tomorrow to release them. Russia said it was giving the rebels another night to think things over. Julian Mannion reports from the border of Chechnya and Dagestan.
At dawn, busloads of Special Forces troops moved forward, and at 10 a.m. local time, the hour of the deadline, they took up positions close to the village. Armoured vehicles started their engines, and in the distance we could hear soldiers using loud hailers to call on the Chechens to give up the hostages and promising that their lives would be spared. But the Chechens did not respond, and the expected attack never took place. According to the Russian news agency TASS, the deadline has been extended, though it's not clear till when. A Russian military spokesman has now said that the deadline was postponed in order to save innocent lives. But tonight, the buses containing the Special Forces troops are returning to positions close to the village, and it seems that the Russians are still considering the military option. Julian Mannion, ITN, at the Chechen-Dagestan border.
Good evening. President Yeltsin ordered his troops into action today in the Russian hostage crisis down on the Chechen border. They went in, guns blazing, 16 hours ago, but again and again they've been fought off by the Chechens. There have undoubtedly been casualties on all sides, though it's impossible to establish any details. The Chechens say 9 hostages died in the Russian attacks. The Russians claim to have got 9 out safely. ITN's Julian Mannion was there throughout the battle today.
The attack began at around 9 a.m. local time. Russian helicopter gunships blasted the outskirts of the village. Explosions could be seen among the houses, and smoke started rising from buildings set on fire. The helicopters dropped flares to deflect anti-aircraft missiles, and Russian combat troops ran forward to take up their assault positions. When we got close to the village on foot, the troops tried to keep us away from the scene. Russian soldiers are still fighting for the edge of the village of Pervomayskoye, well over an hour after the attack began. And the soldiers on the other side of this ditch here are becoming extremely angry at our presence. They've fired warning shots to make us go away, and they're now calling to the authorities further back to take us out. But we stayed and saw the Russian troops using machine guns and mortars to try and dislodge Chechen rebels from houses on the fringe of the village. Somewhere inside those houses were pockets of rebels holding small groups of hostages. But the Russians were unable to cross the open ground between because of the Chechen fire that continued in spite of the bombardment. The helicopters fired again. Russia's Interior Ministry has claimed that no houses containing hostages have been set ablaze in the attack. But on the southern side of the village where we were, the damage seemed widespread and often indiscriminate. A spokesman for the Russian President Boris Yeltsin says that he authorized the assault because he believed that any further delay would threaten the lives of the hostages. But it is difficult to see how this operation can ensure their safety. The Russian government says that the final order for the attack was given after the Chechens fired on Russian negotiators and began shooting the hostages. The Chechen rebel leader General Dudayev has dismissed this statement as a crude lie. Relatives of the civilian hostages gathered near the scene, many in obvious distress. A statement this evening by the Russian government said that their troops have so far managed to free 9 of the hostages. Fighting is still going on, with journalists kept well back. The Russians say they are inside the village, but the Chechens are still putting up fierce resistance. And shells apparently fired by the Chechens have now landed in the village where we are based, just down the road from Pervomayskoye. Residents are now fleeing this area in panic. Julian Mannion, News at 10 on the Chechen-Dagestan border. The Russian hostage rescue operation has turned into a major battle. The village of Pervomayskoye is shrouded in smoke and fog, and journalists are being kept well back. But we know that Russian troops are now fighting house to house inside the village, and they are using overwhelming firepower in spite of the clear danger to the hostages. Russian heavy guns are firing on the village, and in between the blasts we can hear the sounds of rifle and machine gun fire drifting across the plain. It all indicates that the Chechen rebels are still putting up fierce resistance, and Russian officials are now declining to predict how long this operation will take. The Russians now say that they have freed more than 20 of the 100 hostages who were originally held. This morning, about a dozen were moved out of the battle area, with police preventing journalists from interviewing them. At least one of the women had asked the Russians to take her back to the village so she could be with her husband, who's still being held by the Chechens. But all the hostages looked relieved as the bus pulled away. One of the hostages had a bullet wound in the leg, and we were asked to take him to hospital in our bus. On the way, the man gave us one of the first eyewitness accounts of the inferno he survived.
It's like hell there. You don't dare to lift your head. Everything's just going down on top of you. It's coming from here, there, everywhere.
The man escaped by hiding in a loft, but 3 other hostages with him were killed in the shelling. In spite of the hostage casualties, the Russians have now rejected a Chechen offer of fresh talks. The fate of the Chechens now seems sealed, but no one yet knows how many of the hostages will survive. Julian Mannion, News at 10, near the village of Pervomayskoye.
From ITN, News at 10 with Trevor McDonald.
Russia abandons hostages with a vow to crush the Chechens. Good evening. The Russians gave up trying to free the hostages in Pervomayskoye today. Instead, they've been pouring rocket and shell fire into the village near the Chechnya border in an all-out barrage, apparently calculated to obliterate the rebels. A Russian military spokesman said his information was that most of the hostages had already been killed by their Chechen captors anyway. The Chechens denied it. Russian special ground forces had earlier been driven back with heavy casualties. ITN's Julian Mannion was again the only television journalist in the immediate battle zone today.
The Russian army is now using one of the most feared weapons in its arsenal. These are Grad missile launchers, and this morning I saw Russian soldiers firing them into the village of Pervomayskoye, where the Chechen rebels are still holding out. Earlier, Russian helicopter gunships and artillery had conducted the most ferocious bombardment yet of the ruined village. Gunships queued in the skies to take their turn, firing rockets and machine guns. It was during this bombardment that a Russian spokesman announced that most of the hostages are now dead. He claimed that they have been executed by the Chechens on the orders of their leader, General Dudayev, and that the time has now come to bring the military operation to an end. The Russians appear to have virtually written off the hostages in their determination to crush Chechen resistance. No one knows for sure how many hostages are still alive in the destroyed village, but it seems that now they no longer form any part of Russia's military calculations. One possible explanation for the Russian army's hardening attitude is that last night they suffered a severe reverse in house-to-house fighting. Weary Special Forces troops returning from the battle told us that they had taken serious losses in firefights in the center of the village. During the fighting, the Russian Special Forces commander, Colonel Andrei Kristyaninov, was killed. It's a nightmare in there, this officer told me. We fell into a trap. There are bodies everywhere. This afternoon, the Russian authorities told journalists to leave the villages closest to the fighting. There may now be fewer pictures to embarrass the Kremlin, but the desperate battle for Pervomayskoye goes on. Julian Mannion, ITN, near the village of Pervomayskoye.
But just why is Moscow using such ruthless military force against a few Chechens? And why does Chechnya matter to it? The Chechens are a mainly Muslim people with a fiercely independent character who've resisted Russian domination since the early 19th century. Chechnya's independence claim 4 years ago was ignored. A rebellion in Grozny last year was crushed, leaving the capital in ruins. Chechnya is 1,000 miles from Moscow in the Caucasus Mountains, a strategic economic and military corridor between Russia and Central Asia. Neighboring Georgia and Azerbaijan are already independent. Now, Chechnya's cause has been taken up by Muslim sympathizers in Turkey, which has vied for control of the region for centuries. President Yeltsin needs to contain the crisis to restore his credibility. The larger fear is that if he doesn't, other regions might be encouraged to break away from Russia and the terrorism might spread. Good evening. The 4-day battle between Russian troops and Chechen rebels ended today in bloody surrender. President Yeltsin's troops finally took control of the border village, killing a large number of the rebels. Pictures from the battleground today showed the terrible cost in human life. Somehow, 82 of the 100 or so hostages were rescued. The Russians say the rest are missing, though they're not necessarily dead. Our correspondent Julian Mannion reports from the battle zone.
They survived 4 days of hell, but now it has ended in humiliation and defeat. There are 38 Chechen survivors, many of them wounded. Already the interrogators are at work looking for information about the rebel leader Salman Rudayev, one of the few who may possibly have got away. Most of them did not. In the early hours of this morning, in a heavy snowfall, the Chechen rebels made a desperate attempt to break out. As they tried to creep through the Russian lines, another fresh Chechen unit tried to distract the Russian troops by attacking them from behind. But it was not enough, and a stretch of open ground became a killing field. Today, Russian troops fanned out to hunt for possible survivors. If the Chechen commander does get away, it could take a little gloss from Boris Yeltsin's overwhelming victory. Part of that victory has been the release of many hostages. According to the Russians, 82 have survived, more than 20 are unaccounted for. Pervomayskoye is now a smoking ruin, a small village on a country road that turned into a death trap. Julian Mannion, News at 10, near the village of Pervomayskoye.
Julian Mannion was the only British television reporter to witness the fighting close up at the height of the battle for Pervomayskoye. A few minutes ago, I spoke to him at a satellite station a short drive from the village, and I asked him whether there were any winners and losers in the bloody conflict.
Well, the Russian President Boris Yeltsin will definitely count himself among the winners. He's been under mounting political pressure as this year's presidential election approaches, and the main criticisms of his leadership are the failures in law and order in this country and the chaotic war in Chechnya. Now, on this occasion, the president deliberately set out to teach the Chechen rebels a lesson, and in purely military terms, he succeeded about as well as he could have hoped to do. What is still unclear are the long-term political consequences of this bloodshed here on the Chechen-Dagestan border.
is this, you think, you've watched this battle from close range for some time now, is this the end of the Chechen rebellion?
No, most certainly it isn't. The Chechens are extremely determined, even fanatical. This fanaticism has been bred under Russian shell fire, and it's not going to go away. This is a real shock to them. They've suffered great losses here. They've suffered losses of some of their leading personalities. We don't yet know of Salman Rudayev, who is in fact a relative of the Chechen leader, General Dudayev, if he is still alive. But what it is a shock to them. But what the real question now is whether this is going to calm their resistance, if I can put it that way, to quell it, or to inflame it still further.